I want to preface this video by saying that this is not here to dog on the game or run it into the ground for saying that the game is bad. In fact, this game was a success as it sold over 1 million copies and made back all developmental costs. I do not think this game is horrible, I simply just have a sort of history with it and felt the need to make this video. The video might be conducted in a slightly different tone than my other ones, but I felt I had to make this. I will preface this section by saying I have not beaten the game by the time this video has come out. After my first attempt at playing the game for the video, I did wind up picking it back up and playing for about another 4-ish hours. I'll be trying to avoid major spoilers in this video as well, and if I do at all delve into anything spoiler-like, I will mention it ahead of time. This entire video is solely opinion-based, and I would love to hear any of your opinions down in the comments. Do you agree with me on anything? Do you disagree with me on anything? Etc. I'll be down in the comments to talk about things and respond to anything when I can. Without further ado, let's get started. This video originally was going to be much different. I was still going to talk about Biomutant, a bit of its developmental history and what the game is, but from a different lens. I wanted to look back at the game and review it all, from its announcements to its release and post. So, I reinstalled the game, loaded up my old save, and began playing. About 10-20 minutes in, I took my finger off the left stick and just held my controller while staring at the screen. After a slight pause as I sat there thinking, I then said something I never thought I'd say about this game. I don't want to play this anymore. I turned off the recording, set my controller aside, and just sat there, not knowing what to do. If you had told me way back in 2017 after the game's announcement that I'd be making a video about Biomutant in 2022, I'd probably get excited. I'd probably think I'd be talking about how many hours I'd put into the game, and how much I loved it in the video. This, sadly, isn't that video. These are not the words I was hoping to say about the game, as I'm disappointed in Biomutant. Let's go back a bit, back to the year of 2013, when a massive game company of the 2000s had gone bankrupt. It even had its name assumed by another company years later. Some of you may know what company that is, which is THQ, a company responsible for many of the games that I'd played years before. These guys are responsible for developing and publishing many of the games that I adored playing while growing up. Darksiders 1 and 2, Saints Row the 3rd, Nicktoons Battle for Volcano Island, Red Faction Guerrilla, The Blob 1 and 2, Nicktoons Globs of Doom, and more. THQ had many titles under its name, and although it was kind of hard to hear that the company was going under in 2013, I heard even more when I learned from a friend that THQ had plans to make other Darksiders games for the other 4 Horsemen who didn't get a mainline game. After learning that THQ was going to cease, it felt like a bittersweet ending to a friendship that had formed long ago. Seeing that THQ logo at the opening of games was like a friend coming over for a playdate, or a sleepover when I'd launch my PS2 with Globs of Doom after school and just play for hours. It wasn't until later in 2016 did THQ seemingly come back into the limelight, as it announced that another company by the name of Nordic Games was going to be taking up the THQ name and even receive some of the titles and IPs from the previous studio. One big one of note that excited me was Darksiders. Thanks to THQ Nordic, we did get those other Darksiders games, Darksiders 3 and Darksiders Genesis, which were both met with somewhat middling reviews, but it was fantastic to finally see this franchise get the continuation it deserved. Now just to hope for a new The Blob game, but I doubt we'll get anything like that. Although I was excited for the prospect of all the things this company could do with some of my favorite IPs, there was something that stole the cake for me once I caught wind of it. THQ Nordic was publishing a new IP, and it was being developed by the former Just Cause developers. I was excited and started to do some research. It was then I found a cinematic trailer for the 2017 GamesCom showcase for Biomutant. This cinematic trailer instilled hype into me, and I quickly found early gameplay footage that they also showcased at the event, and although it looked rough, it was more than enough to get me excited for what this game was going to be. Even rewatching both these trailers while writing this video makes me excited and want to boot up the game and get playing. I began digging around afterward for something more, and eventually found a brief summary about it. I found out that Biomutant was going to be a new open-world action-adventure RPG with emphasis on the game's story, combat, and exploration. You, the player, will play as one of these little critters in the new world, where the tree of life is deteriorating and it's up to you to go forth and save it. Craft weapons, use mutations, and sick as all hell kung fu skills to help save the new world. A simple premise, but one that can be executed really well, especially when focusing on fleshing out the gameplay aspects of it all. 2018 eventually rolls around, and Biomutant is back at Gamescom with more gameplay. It looked even better, and the biggest thing that jumped out to me now was the gameplay. The original gameplay trailer had showcased some combat, but now it looked faster, it looked more fluid, most importantly it looked so fucking cool. It was still a bit rough visually in some areas, and although the UI had improved, it was much to be desired. This is also some of the first gameplay we got to see of the mutations, one of the biggest elements to the game and the source of one of my issues with it as well, but we'll get to all that soon. Development on the game had always been relatively silent, but I felt as though the drought of news from 2019 through 2020 was very long, but the wait was worth it with a new gameplay trailer. The gameplay looked amazing, and it fueled my excitement even more that I threw away all of my doubts about the game, especially once I saw the release date for it. At the end of the trailer, they stated that they wouldn't be releasing the game until they were happy with it. And I personally had some mixed emotions about it at the time, but I can absolutely appreciate that now. I was sad that I'd probably have to wait another year or two before I could play the game, but yet I was happy that the developers were going to spend as much time as they needed to make a product that they were happy with. And personally, I can relate to this. I don't like putting out half-assed projects, nor do I want to put out a project that I'm not happy with. Even if it's rough, I still want to at least be happy with it. So, waiting continued, and the silence continued as well. To the point that I felt like the game was stuck in development hell and began to lose hope. But luckily, more news surfaced, and finally, the game had an official release date. The developers began talking about the game more, what took so long, talking about more of the features of the game and more. It felt exciting to see all this information come out of the floodgates, and for me, it felt like I was finally getting the game I had been waiting so long to play. It was almost finally in my hands, and it felt great. The day came, the game was finally out, and finally I could get my hands on it and play. I did not buy the game when it was released. I was hesitant, as I saw the review scores and many outlets trashing the game. There were some that were even saying that this wasn't all that bad, but they were few. No, there's no way, right? I waited so long for this, there's no way it's bad. Despite the reviews, I eventually did buy the game. I didn't believe anything reviewers said and couldn't fathom the idea that this game wasn't going to be the huge title I thought it was going to be. I launched the game, played about 3 hours before I put the controller down. My experience was lukewarm, to say the least. I knew I didn't get the game I wanted, but I still enjoyed what was given for my playtime. I then turned in for the night and told myself that I was going to come back to it. After all, I was enjoying the game, and I excused all of its shortcomings and was hopeful that my experience then would not reflect how I'd feel while playing the rest of it. I never went back. I never went back to play the game, and even uninstalled it at one point. I had forgotten about Biomutant and had moved on until I was browsing through my games list and wanted to go back and play it. As stated before, I wanted to make a look back onto the game and talk about the game as a video, and here we are. The moment that I didn't want to play it anymore, I sat there and began to wonder, why? Why did I not want to play? Why was it so hard to get me to play? Why did I stop playing before? Why was this game that I had so much hype for now a game that I felt disappointed with? Biomutant was met with many mixed reviews when the game was released, some going as far as saying it was the worst AAA release of the year. It was a stark contrast to how I felt when I first started to play it, as I continued to look past its shortcomings and looked at the game from an extremely biased lens. It wasn't until I had replayed it for the video that this all began to set in. The world felt empty. The quests felt bad and repetitive. The combat felt clunky occasionally. The story for me wasn't great. And there were many parts of the game that genuinely were just not enjoyable to play through. Now, let's unpack that. Biomutant's open world is full of different key points scattered about, whether it be abandoned outposts, ruins, bunkers, wastelands, etc. Sometimes there are little camps, slavers, massive creatures, or such around to dispatch as well. Besides this, these locations felt very empty. I didn't feel like I was exploring or understanding this world, but I felt like I was just traveling around to fill checklists in each area. When entering a new area, it even pulls up a checklist of all the things that are there. I didn't like having everything laid out for me like this, as it removed all sort of discovery from the location. I didn't feel excited when I found new things because I knew it was there. These locations would also only take even a few minutes to even clear and find everything. And once you do find everything, there's no reason to go back. There's nothing to do there now. After you do something in one area, there's just no reason to continue exploring it. Games can have this checklist style of things, but I feel it should be reserved for collectibles and such. Some games I've played even have these checklists like Biomutant, but they're for different reasons. Like here in Dust Divers. This game shows these checklists as things to earn and find in each level, as everything is level and instance-based. Even roaming around the main hub to find Dragon Vein stones, this game's way of allowing the player to progress the story, I'm told they are nearby, but each one is hidden somewhere in the area. I'm not told as to specifically where. Some of these little bastards were even hidden pretty well, and in creative ways. Speaking of Dusk Divers, I plan on doing a video on it in the future, so please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to get notified when I get that video out of the oven and into your sub box. Now, back to the video. In Biomutant, since it's open world, it can't lean on this instance-based checklist idea, especially if I'm wanting to explore around. The game even has a habit of sometimes outright showing me almost exactly where there's something to loot or interact with inside of the area without being near it. This removes any sort of enjoyment for me when finding things and exploring around. It was never hard to find something, except for one thing in particular, but we'll get to that in a moment. For example, I was walking along this path when the game tells me, hey, there's something behind here, so I use my clunk fist to break the wall and get the loot. This wasn't me discovering something and being rewarded for it. This was me doing what the game is telling me to do and getting a reward for following instructions. This would have felt so much more rewarding if I'd used context clues and got through without the game outright pointing it out to me. Now I want to go back and analyze a little example that I had mentioned before. When I killed a monster, which was actually pretty cool to get ambushed like this in the open world, I got a vault key for the town nearby. I had already looted this place to hell and back, so it gave me some excitement as to having to explore around to find this location and use the key to get some sort of reward. I searched and felt like maybe I'm missing something. I've turned this place upside down already until I realized this vault was not hidden inside the city. And in fact, it was right next to the battle that took place just moments ago. The vault itself also felt a tad underwhelming, but it was at least an attempt at creating secondary goals completely separate from everything else. But to give credit where credit is due, I would have not even known about the vaults or even found a vault if I hadn't gone and found this fight. Moving on, let's briefly talk about the side quests. This game's side quests also just did not feel great, as they just felt like another checklist of doing X amount of something in different spots around the map. None of them felt worth my time or interesting enough to bother even attempting. They felt very cookie cutter from one another, and as you can imagine, felt very repetitive. I'll give the main quests some credit. Although they were very lackluster, they were at least varied enough and enjoyable enough to play through. Most of them were to get X and bring X to fix X, others were to liberate X or to take out X. That was pretty much it, besides the boss fights and a few one-off quests that I ran into. The boss fights, note I only played through one myself, was very clunky and not fun. I was restricted to this mech that I had built in the main quest lines to build and traverse the no oxygen zone, and itself did not feel good to pilot and deal with normal enemies. After using it once, I avoided using it after. Speaking of clunky, it's probably best I start talking about one of the biggest disappointments in the game, which resides in the combat. Biomutant's combat, as seen and mentioned before, utilizes guns, melee weapons, and mutations. Depending on how you build your character and stats, you may lean one way over the others, but I personally like the idea of having everything at my disposal and utilizing and weaving in everything in combat. The combat at times can feel good, and I could see exactly what they were going for, but due to enemy hit stun being practically non-existent in some instances, it sours the few moments where I feel like things are working well. As you level, you can unlock more moves based on the different weapon types so you can do more flashier combos, and after getting some decent materials, I crafted and stuck with the crush weapons, which are like hammers. I mostly did stick with them, mostly for this ability here, which allowed me to heal off of kills, which I felt almost vital for me when I'm so outnumbered almost all the time. The guns felt decent, as they were consistent with how they worked and even felt good to weave in during my melee and range combos. The mutations in the game were initially one of the game's main selling points, as it was even shown off in the cinematic trailer. Based on the cinematic trailer and what we were shown in some of the early gameplay showcases, mutations were gained through instances rather than a skill point redemption system. The skill point redemption system is technically a bit better, allowing for more freedom of choice from the player when unlocking things, but it felt it was a missed opportunity to not go with this idea of exploring to unlock mutations. The game has an exploring factor where you go and find these capsules to get set skill points to unlock more mutations, but this could have been done better to help fix the game's issue with exploration as a whole. In fact, let's try and imagine what mutations would be like with a different and more engaging system. Here's one way I feel this could have been done while keeping the original system fairly intact. In Biomutant, there are mutations segmented into two lists, mutations and psi powers, but I would combine these two lists. The reason for doing so is because these abilities are rather indistinguishable from one another in purpose and style. The only thing that does really separate them are the ones that have requirements of light and dark aura, which is basically the game's reputation system. The main list will have all of the abilities and then be segmented a bit further based on elemental properties, especially since the game already has this idea of elemental damage types. Heat, biohazard, cold, and radioactivity are the damage types, so we'll split them up like that, and those that don't inherently do damage or don't have elemental properties, we'll filter in or put them in a general category where any points can be used on them. And personally, if one wanted to have a light versus dark mutations choice, I'd go ahead and just create a set for each different category. Now that the lists have been sorted, let's look at how we then implement this into the game's already pre-existing systems and make it work with our own twist. I want to take the idea of the pre-existing biofuel plates and add a change. Instead of searching for these canisters, the player will go about and find actual instances in the world. Maybe even defeating other mutants or creatures who emit heightened properties like these, the player could absorb to gain points or mutation experience. To help the player find areas with these said things in them, I'd of course nix them from the checklist in different areas and use environmental cues to help them figure out something is nearby. Like this frozen bunker to say, hey, there's some cold mutation points in here for you to get. For areas like this, it's up to the player to itemize accordingly to survive said conditions or last longer under said conditions, allowing players to mix and match gear sets and equipment for what's more effective. Another unique way to have this tie-in is by having elemental inflicted locations be more traversable or open up more explorable spots within. When the player absorbs whatever is afflicting the area, such as the ice melting, and revealing a chest or fires being put out to reveal a new passageway. This can even be simplified further as to not have separate points or experience and keep the universal point system from before, and implement the previously mentioned ways of getting said points. I'd also completely get rid of the idea of using the same points to increase resistances. I'd instead tie this directly to leveling or leave it to the equipment you're wearing. You could possibly even allow the crafting system to enhance and upgrade your gear with better resistances, since there is also an add-on system in crafting that could easily incorporate this as well. With a system like this, the player is rewarded for exploring more, rewarded for utilizing their tools and abilities, and it even ties into the overarching theme of the game as well. Overall, I think a system like this would have been great to have, but with it, other things would definitely need to get changed around as well, like the previously mentioned checklist for different areas. I could see that they were possibly trying to have this idea of having areas afflicted with different things, hence the ice over bunker and the areas covered in mist, but it doesn't go any further than just being a nuisance to the player while exploring. What do you all think? Do you think this would be a better system, or do you have another idea entirely for how this should all work? Let me know down in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you all have to say. Also wanted to briefly mention the elemental damage types, as they overall don't do anything else besides more or less damage in some instances with a damage over time effect. They all work the same and are basically only differentiated for flavor reasons. They each also had a crowd control effect involved when the stats stacked up, but each one was basically the exact same thing, just different animations. This was a huge issue in another game I really liked called Godfall, which had been undergoing many changes and reworks to make the game what it is today. A more polished and much more overall improved version of what the game once was. After all of its changes, the game's statuses were now differentiated from another with their own purposes, on all having their own extra little flair with what they do. To wrap up, I wanted to at least give credit where credit is due, and talk about things that I liked, and even enjoyed when playing the game. Let's leave this all on a happier note. First off, the narrator. This seemed to be a complaint for a lot of people, saying that he was very annoying and spoke way too much, but personally, I really liked the narrator, and found his delivery to be really well done and even elevated some moments for me when playing. The developers did include a setting that allowed the player to lower the narrator's frequency, so at least players that did find him annoying could do something about it. I enjoyed some character interactions, especially with Out of Date, who I felt was actually written pretty well. He was basically one of the only NPCs I had come across that I genuinely liked and wanted to see more of. I loved the dialogue between the light and dark critters. Their dynamic was fantastic, and the delivery of lines from each voice actor was great as well. The world and themes felt fun and unique, with some very blatant but interesting pollution themes spread about. The game's way of storytelling through the narrator, posters, and items I enjoyed as well. Different words are sounded out and spelled differently, and items are called different things, as the new world doesn't exactly know what these things left behind really are. This little flavor was a nice touch, and showed that they thought about the minor details of everything. When the combat works, it's fun, and feels good to complete combos and sweep away my enemies in a flurry of hammer strikes, gunshots, and poison. The crafting system is really enjoyable, and has a surprising amount of depth to it, allowing you to even take apart weapons and armor to craft even more unique weapons and upgrade your armor even further. Although it did take a second to understand it, it was very fun to try and make different things. Each weapon type, although having short combo lists, felt varied enough visually and playstyle wise to make each weapon type interesting in each one's own right. Locations, although empty, were visually really nice to look at, and I found myself enjoying the scenery more than I ever thought I would. There are some great looking spots across the game, and one place of note that I loved the look of was the Subnautica station. I also really liked the music of the game. I found myself occasionally just sitting and enjoying it, as each orchestral track was fantastic and added to the game's overall experience. Most of the background music from this video was also in fact from the game's OST. And that's pretty much it. So let's wrap this up. I don't like talking negatively about things, nor do I ever want to make a video just bashing something just because I don't like it. When it comes to Biomutant, I don't think the game is bad. It's decent, but it just hurts so much to see the game I had been waiting so long for be so disappointing to me in so many areas. If somehow any THQ Nordic guys or Experiment 101 devs find this video and haven't clicked off yet, I want to say thank you. Despite me being disappointed in Biomutant, I'd enjoyed my time with it, despite it being relatively short. You deliver an experience to the world that you wanted to share, and that alone I find commendable. I know I haven't beaten the game, but I'll know I'll be back to play it even after this video goes live. And apparently, this won't be the last time we'll be seeing Biomutant either. I'm eager to see what awaits me in Experiment 101's next adventure. Ever since I felt so burned by Biomutant, the only game that I expressed so much immense hype for since then was Smash Ultimate and Pokemon Legends. But here in 2022, I've rekindled that excitement and hype for new releases. Infinite Guitars, Nine Souls, Ghostwire Tokyo, Neon White, Forspoken, Sea of Stars, and more. But Biomutant for sure may not be my number 1. Hell, it's not even my number 5. But it's a game I'll never forget. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. This one meant a lot to me, and I'm so happy to finally share this one with you all. Please consider liking the video, subscribing, and ringing the bell. I try to put a lot of work into these weekly videos for you all, so I'd hate for you to miss them when they're hot out of the oven. I'd also like to carry this conversation over to the comments to hear what you all think about Biomutant, and talk about other things that I mentioned before. I'll be down there. As usual, my name is CrossVee, and I hope to see you all next week. Peace.